the shadowed halls of medieval Europe, where flickering torches cast long silhouettes across stone walls, marriage was not the fairy tale union of two souls in love. No, it was a calculated contract and exchange not of vows, but of power, land, coin, and lineage. Imagine a noble family gathered around a heavy oak table. Maps are unrolled, names listed, and alliances debated. The daughter, no more than 12, sits quietly at the corner. Her fate is being negotiated over goblets of wine and soft murmurs of her dowry. She knows her place. She is the seal on a treaty, the key to land, the bringer of heirs. In the medieval world, marriage was strategy. Love, if it came at all, was a luxury and accident. The dowry, a bride's price. Let's begin with the bride's price, known as the dowry. This was no romantic gift, it was currency. A noblewoman's dowry might include vast tracts of land, livestock, chests of silver coins, or even entire villages. In Italy, a well-born girl's dowry could equal the value of a small army. For the gentry, dowries were smaller, but no less significant. A family might sell their last acre of farmland, or pledge future harvests just to secure their daughter a place in a wealthier house. This wasn't generosity, it was survival. But here's the strange part. Dowries weren't always about money. In Eastern Europe, dowries often came in the form of finely woven linens, barrels of ale, or a prized cow named after a family ancestor. In some cases, a bride was sent to her new husband with servants, horses, and an entire wardrobe stitched with symbols of her house. If a man was particularly powerful or particularly poor, he might negotiate for a reverse dowry, also called a morning gift. This was what the husband gave to his wife the morning after their wedding, symbolizing her worth or perhaps his guilt. The betrothal, binding before the wedding forget proposals under moonlight. In medieval Europe, betrothals were business deals. Two fathers met, discussed terms, and struck a bargain. Often this happened when the bride and groom were still children. There are records of betrothals between infants' alliances plotted decades before the marriage ever took place. Once agreed upon, the betrothal was legally binding. Breaking it could lead to lawsuits, fines, and disgrace. A broken betrothal was considered a violation of honor akin to betrayal. In some places, if either party backed out, the other could claim damages in court. And what of the couple? They might meet once if they were lucky. Often they wouldn't set eyes on each other until the wedding day. And if love bloomed elsewhere, too bad, the heart bowed before the sword and the purse. Marriage as a power play, every marriage was a move on the chessboard of medieval politics. Kings married off their daughters to seal peace treaties. Barons gave their sons in marriage to gain control of trade routes. A single wedding could unite kingdoms or start wars. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century. Her first marriage to King Louis VII of France brought Aquitaine under French rule. When the union soured, she maneuvered her way into the arms of Henry Plantagenet, soon to be King of England, taking all her lands with her. That one marriage shifted the balance of power in Western Europe. Even commoners played the game, albeit on a smaller scale. A miller's daughter might marry the blacksmith's son, ensuring a steady flow of grain and metal. Marriage meant survival, protection, and the hope of a future. Love was a bonus, passion, a risk. Marriage contracts. Inked with duty marriage wasn't complete without a contract often drawn up by priests or scribes, sealed with wax, witnessed by family elders, and filled with elaborate legal clauses. Some of these contracts are still preserved. One from 1381 details a merchant's daughter being married off with the stipulation that she must bear at least one male heir within 5 years or risk annulment. Another, from Germany, includes a line promising that should the bride bring shame by drunkenness or dance with men, her portion shall be halved. These were not tender words. They were cold safeguards written with the ink of caution and the hand of experience. The church blessed the union, but make no mistake, it was the family ledger that truly sanctified the bond. And yet, whispers of romance, despite the rigidity, glimmers of tenderness sometimes broke through. A young couple might exchange secret notes, written in Latin or early French, hidden in prayer books or under dining plates. These letters were filled with metaphors comparing lips to rose petals or calling love a dangerous hunt through the forest. Courtly love flourished in songs and poems, even if it rarely reached the marriage bed. Knights penned verses to ladies they could never have, while married women sometimes found comfort in the arms or eyes of troubadours and pages. It was dangerous, forbidden, and deeply human. In the cold logic of marriage, hearts still beat. The beginning of a strange love story, and so we end part one at the beginning. The contracts have been signed, the dowry packed, the bride veiled, the groom prepared. They've never touched, barely spoken. Yet by morning they'll be man and wife. What lies ahead? Rituals so strange they'll make your skin crawl, wedding feasts with fertility games, ceremonies watched by crowds, and customs that blend superstition with sanctity. But for now, they wait he at the church gate, she in a candle-lit chamber 2 pieces moved on a medieval board. A game of love, war, and legacy, just beginning. Before the wedding bells tolled, before the banners were raised and the crowds gathered, the bride vanished. She was not kidnapped, she was not lost, she was hidden on purpose. This was the bride's retreat, a curious and solemn tradition in many corners of medieval Europe, where the young woman, sometimes barely of age, sometimes still a child, was removed from the world for a time of preparation, purification and reflection. What sounds spiritual today had strange, rigid, and often stifling origins. It was a time of ritual, a time of silence, a time of waiting. The chamber of stillness in the days or even weeks before the marriage. The bride was led to a private chamber, often in her father's house or the estate of a wealthy kinsman. This room was sacred and shadowed, shut off from noise, gossip, and even light. In wealthier homes, it was hung with thick tapestries to muffle sound and lined with heavy curtains. Servants lit candles, not to illuminate, but to sanctify. She was not alone, but she was not free. An older woman, sometimes her mother. More often, a midwife or a crone with deep knowledge of womanhood remained with her. These women were guardians, yes, but also instructors. They passed down advice about marriage, childbirth, submission, modesty, and how to keep a household afloat even when love was absent. In eastern France and parts of Bavaria, this practice was known as la veille, the vigil. In Anglo-Saxon England, it was called the bride fast. To the outside world, she was becoming invisible. But inside, something was taking shape. The purification bath, one of the oldest customs in the bridal retreat, was the ritual bath. The bath itself was no ordinary dip in water. It was an act of spiritual and bodily cleansing, rooted partly in pagan tradition, partly in Christian doctrine. The water was infused with herbs: lavender for calm, rosemary for remembrance, chamomile for purity, and myrrh or rose petals if they could be afforded. In noble houses, the water was sometimes blessed by a priest. The bath was drawn in a copper or wooden tub, and attendants scrubbed the bride gently, while older women sang hymns or whispered incantations. In rural villages, this ritual took place at dusk under the moonlight. In streams or bathhouses fed by natural springs, considered sacred by some and healing by others. For the church, the bath symbolized virginity renewed. For the family, it meant she was ready. For the bride, no one ever asked. Veiling the virgin. After her purification, the bride was dressed not in finery, but in simplicity. A shift of plain linen, hair unbraided. No jewels, no ribbons, no crowns, her eyes cast downward. This was the image of the chaste virgin, a symbol the church cherished, even fetishized. From this point on, the bride's face might be hidden from all men except her closest kin. A veil, often white but sometimes pale blue, would cover her hair and part of her features. It was believed that showing her face too soon would attract evil spirits, or worse, the envy of other women. In parts of Scandinavia, they went even further. The bride was blindfolded until the wedding day, to shield her innocence from the world. It was not about modesty, it was about control. The words of warning within the retreat, the bride was schooled in what lay ahead. Older women recounted their own experiences, some tender, many terrifying. They spoke of pain, of silence, of resilience, of how to keep a drunken husband from raising his hand, of how to survive miscarriage without midwives, of how to serve at the feast without slipping into scandal. Of how to smile when unloved? These were not lessons of love. These were lessons of survival. A noblewoman might be taught how to manage an estate. A merchant's daughter would learn how to track coin and grain. A peasant girl might be instructed on herbs for easing childbirth or ending it. And always they were warned, never raise your voice. Never answer back. A good wife is like a candle seen, not heard. This retreat was not just about transformation. It was indoctrination. The gifts and tokens on the eve of her wedding, the bride was presented with gifts not by her groom but by her female kin. These were tokens of womanhood. A comb carved from bone, symbolizing grooming and discipline, a spindle for weaving, a knife not for violence, but for cutting bread, feeding others before herself, a mirror, always small and always polished, symbolizing introspection, not vanity. In the wealthier courts, the gifts were ornate. Pearl-encrusted girdles, ivory prayer books, jeweled rosaries, but their meaning was the same. They were the tools of a quiet life. Some brides were also given a belt or girdle to wear under their clothing, a symbol of chastity. It might be locked by a key, held by the groom until the wedding night. This was no myth. These chastity belts were rare but real and deeply symbolic. She was being given to someone else, body and soul. The morning before, on the final morning, the chamber was opened. The scent of wax and herbs spilled into the hallway. The bride emerged like a relic being unveiled. Dressed now in color, perhaps green for fertility or red for honor, her hair braided with ribbons, her fingers anointed with oil. Her face, still veiled, remained unreadable. She would walk in silence to the place of ceremony. In some towns, church bells would toll not for joy, but warning, a maiden was crossing the threshold. And everyone knew, once she passed through the church doors, she would never return the same. Her girlhood, her solitude, her autonomy left behind like ashes in that quiet room. Thus ends the bride's retreat, a ritual both ancient and unsettling. A passage not of joy, but of surrender. But this is only the beginning. As the wedding ceremony concluded beneath the vaulted ceilings of stone chapels or among rose-draped altars in the village square, all eyes turned not to the feast but to the bed. In medieval Europe, the marriage was not truly complete until the act of consummation, the physical sealing of the union. And unlike the secrecy we associate with modern nuptial nights, the Middle Ages had no patience for mystery. They demanded proof. Welcome to the bridal chamber, a tradition where privacy ended at the doorway and newlyweds found their first night wrapped in rituals, witnesses, and superstition. It was not always romantic. It was rarely private. But it was law, custom, and expectation woven together with both reverence and voyeurism. The procession to the bed, once the vows were exchanged, the newlyweds were paraded through the village escorted by musicians, priests, family, and townsfolk. They walked side by side, often still veiled, their fingers sometimes bound together by silk cords. In some regions of France and England, this procession was noisy in body, filled with laughter, teasing and suggestive jokes from guests meant to ease tension but more likely to embarrass the couple. But the procession was not aimless. It ended at the bridal chamber, a room meticulously prepared, cleaned, blessed, perfumed, and sometimes watched. In noble houses, the bed itself was a masterpiece, high wooden frames, thick woolen curtains, embroidered sheets. Every detail a symbol of wealth and now legacy. This bed was not just furniture, it was a throne, a cradle, a witness. And the crowd was not yet finished. The witnesses. You may find it hard to believe, but in many noble households consummation required witnesses. No, they didn't stay for the act, but they stood by until the couple lay down. In some cases, they helped disrobe the bride or lead the groom to the bed. In royal marriages, entire courts might follow the couple into the room cheering, clapping, and offering blessings. The tokens of proof. In households obsessed with lineage and legitimacy, proof of consummation was more than gossip. It was evidence. In aristocratic homes, a servant was often tasked with examining the sheets the next morning. The goal, to find blood, sign of the bride's virginity and confirmation that the marriage had been fulfilled. In some traditions, the stained sheets were publicly displayed, yes, publicly, hung from the window or shown at the breakfast table like a flag of triumph the morning after. At dawn, the world expected smiles. The couple emerged dressed in fresh garments, sometimes holding hands, often avoiding eye contact. They were now man and wife in the eyes of God, law, and every neighbor from the castle cook to the village shepherd. In some households, a morning gift was presented by the groom, a token of affection and responsibility. This might be a piece of land, a jewel, or a written promise of protection. It was meant to honor the bride, though cynics often saw it as payment. The couple would then kneel together for one final blessing, thanking God for a successful union and perhaps praying no child would come too soon or too late. Echoes of power and pain. For all its pageantry, the bridal chamber blessing was never about the couple. It was about witnessing, about proving, about controlling. The bed became a courtroom. The sheets, evidence. The night itself, a verdict. Love had no seat at the table. But expectation was everywhere. In the walls, in the prayers, in the stare of the midwife waiting just beyond the curtains. And yet, some couples made it their own. They laughed. They whispered. They touched each other not as strangers, but as co-conspirators in a world that watched too closely. In rare cases, affection bloomed from that night forward. But always, it began here beneath layers of cloth, candles, and eyes. Thus ends the tale of the bridal chamber, blessing, a strange, sacred, and scandalous rite lost to time. Yet, echoing in the stories, we still tell about what it means to love and to be seen. The vows had been spoken. The bed had been blessed. The union consummated, or at least assumed. Now the real spectacle began. The wedding feast in medieval Europe was not merely a celebration. It was a performance, a declaration of wealth, a test of generosity, and sometimes a boiling pot of scandal, lust, and mischief. This was not a polite dinner party. This was indulgence, ritual, fertility magic, and public theater rolled into one thundering event lasting not hours, but days. Let us pull back the heavy wooden doors, step across the threshold of a great hall lined with tapestries and torchlight, and join the riotous world of medieval wedding feasts and festival games. The banquet of status, the higher your rank, the longer and more lavish your feast. For nobles, the wedding meal might span 3 days. In royal courts, a week. Imagine, tables so long they vanished into darkness, lined with trencher-thick slabs of stale bread used as plates. These would be soaked in meat juices and gravy, eaten by the poor after the nobles were done. The bride and groom sat at the high table, slightly elevated, flanked by their most powerful kin. Behind them, coats of arms, symbols of houses united through this sacred and strategic bond. Musicians played lutes and harps. Singers sang ballads of noble lovers and chaste queens. Some halls even hired mummers, masked actors who danced and mimed stories of gods and beasts, heroes and fools. Beneath the performance, the message was clear. This union had the favor of heaven, myth, and man, and on the table, gluttony. The menu of magnificence meat was the centerpiece. Whole roast boars with apples in their mouths. Swans dressed in their own feathers. Pies filled with live blackbirds, yes. This was real, so when cut open, the birds would fly out, a sign of the bride's fertility and the groom's virility. For royalty, there might be peacock, its skin reattached after roasting, bejeweled with tiny sapphires. Sauces made with almonds, vinegar, cloves, and cinnamon, poured over goose or deer, eels from the river. Venison from the king's own hunt, beer and wine flowed freely. Even the poorest guests drank that night. For peasants, the feast was simpler but no less joyful: stews, crusty bread, wheels of cheese, ale thick with barley and laughter. They sang ribald songs and toasted until speech slurred. Everyone was fed, everyone danced, and everyone watched, because after the feast came the games. Fertility games and curious customs. Medieval marriage was about producing heirs, and so many of the games at wedding feasts were designed not to entertain but to invoke fertility, often with a wild and unmistakably erotic edge. In parts of Wales, guests would throw grains and seeds at the couple not as a blessing, but a spell meant to spark conception. In Hungary, guests raced to place a shoe beneath the bridal bed, believing it would ensure many children if done before midnight. In France, there was a bizarre tradition called the chevaret. Young men from the village gathered outside the couple, window on the wedding night and made a hideous racket banging pots, shouting crude jokes, singing bawdy songs. If the groom didn't pay them off with wine or silver, they would continue all night. In England, after the bedding ceremony, there was often a waking the next morning, where guests barged into the bridal chamber with music and mock-serious demands for confirmation of the act. This wasn't just mischief, it was public verification cloaked in humor. The bride's dance and the coin toss during the feast. The bride was often expected to perform a ritual dance slow, circular, symbolic of continuity and renewal. Guests would approach and drop coins into a basket or even directly into the bride's shoes. In some villages, the bride ale was a tradition where the bride sold cups of specially brewed ale to guests, symbolizing her role in nourishing the household. The money raised sometimes helped pay for the wedding, practical and symbolic at once. Another common sight? A mock fight between unmarried men, often drunken, always competitive, vying for the bride's garter. Once removed, the garter was flung into the crowd. The man who caught it was said to be the next to marry. It was a moment both festive and strange, where marriage, fertility, and public humiliation mingled freely. Drunken oracles and cake prophecies, superstition ran deep in medieval minds, and weddings were fertile ground for prophecy. A particularly strange custom involved baking a bride cake, a flat-spiced loaf, not sweet but heavy with symbolism. A piece was broken over the bride's head to bring good luck, and the crumbs were gathered as charms. Unmarried guests were encouraged to place crumbs of the cake under their pillows, hoping to dream of their future spouse. Some would walk backwards from the hall to their homes, whispering the name of a desired suitor, invoking love through ritualized nonsense. In Germanic traditions, drunk guests would be asked to prophesy how many children the couple would bear. The more outrageous the number, the more delighted the guests. But not all predictions were welcomed. An ill omen, a broken glass. A candle extinguished could cast a pall over the whole celebration. In one record from 1323, a guest who spilled salt at a noble wedding was blamed for the couple's later childlessness. Salt, you see, was sacred. Spill it, and the gods might take offense. When the feast turned, dark weddings brought together enemies under the guise of festivity. It was not uncommon for feasts to end in blood. In 1387, a minor feud between rival families in Lombardy ignited during a toast. One man insulted the bride's lineage, and swords were drawn. The feast ended with 6 dead and a bride weeping in her blood-stained gown. Poisonings, duels, and even kidnappings occurred when power, alcohol, and pride mixed. A powerful marriage meant new alliances and new enemies. The same table that groaned under the weight of roasted venison might, hours later, be overturned in fury. Joy and judgment for the couple. The feast was both celebration and examination. Did the groom distribute food fairly? Did he drink with the peasants or scorn them? Did the bride dance with dignity or delight? Did she drink? Did she laugh too loudly? Every gesture was noted, gossiped about, judged, because in the medieval world, marriage was theater, and the wedding feast, its grandest act. The torches had dimmed. The guests, full of meat and wine, had staggered from the hall. The songs had faded, replaced by silence so sharp it seemed to ring. Behind closed doors, the true moment of medieval marriage began, not the ceremony. Not the feast, but the consummation. This was the hour when the marriage was either made or questioned, a union unsealed by flesh, not faith. In the eyes of law, nobility, and the church, a wedding was only valid if it was consummated physically and beyond dispute, and the pressure, tremendous. Because what happened or didn't beneath those embroidered sheets had the power to build dynasties or tear them apart. The weight of a night in noble courts, consummation was not just a personal event, it was a political milestone. The couple wasn't merely expected to share a bed. They were expected to perform a duty. One act, one night, one future. If the groom failed, whispers followed. If the bride bled, cheers erupted. If there was silence and no evidence, consequences. Records from the 12th century onward are filled with strange, uncomfortable testimonies of these nights. Nobles described the thundering sighs of success and the groans of holy union. Yes, they documented these things. Why? Because proof of consummation secured the contract. If ever challenged, witnesses would be needed. In some places, like Brittany and Aragon, written statements were even prepared in advance. I, servant to the house of underscore, heard the bride's cry and testify to the bond completed. Imagine that, your marriage, notarized by noise. But why so much obsession? Because without consummation, a marriage could be annulled. And in a world where heirs meant land, legacy, and power, an unconsummated union was dangerous. The impotence trial, what happened when the groom could not perform? What if the bride willing or not remained untouched? Enter one of the strangest spectacles of medieval marriage law, the trial of impotence. Yes, such trials were real and brutal. If a wife claimed her marriage remained incomplete, the church could order the husband to prove his virility. This might involve physical examination by midwives, the presentation of evidence from servants, or even a demonstration before selected clergy, thankfully, behind closed doors. A famous case from 1426 saw Sir Richard de Langley accused of long coldness toward his wife. After 2 years of barren silence in their bed, she appealed to the bishop. Physicians examined Sir Richard and declared him unfit by nature. His lands returned to his wife's family, and the marriage was dissolved. There were cases in which the groom was ordered to drink aphrodisiac potions or attend healing shrines, such as that of St. Valentine, believed to restore lost desire. Some were sent on pilgrimages to prove their intent. Failure meant public disgrace, sometimes exile, because if you could not consummate a marriage, you could not be trusted to carry a house. The bride's silence, and what of the bride? Her voice was quieter in the historical record, but no less vital. A bride was expected to submit regardless of fear or unfamiliarity. Consent in medieval law was complicated. The church insisted on mutual agreement, but society often blurred the lines. If the family approved, if the marriage was legal, a bride's no was often ignored. This made the first night a haunting paradox, sacred and sanctioned, but often silent. In some cases, particularly among noble girls married in their early teens, the church would delay consummation until a more suitable age was reached. In others, there was no waiting. The bride was dressed, paraded, and brought to bed with all the pressure of family honor weighing on her narrow shoulders. And if she cried? If she resisted? Some families treated it as shyness, others disobedience. Rarely did anyone listen. But should she fulfill her duty, and blood was seen on the sheets, it was heralded as a badge of virtue, a publicly praised symbol of her purity. Imagine that, your pain, your body, your privacy, displayed for prestige, the morning gift, reward, or remorse? Once consummation was presumed, whether by sounds, stains, or testimony, the groom was expected to present the morning gift. This was a tradition rooted in Germanic law, a token of affection, yes, but also of legal recognition. It served as a safeguard for the bride. A dowry in reverse? The gift might be a parcel of land, a small manor, a herd of sheep, or a ring of unusual worth. For princesses, the morning gift could be a city, as in the case of Queen Margaret of Scotland, who received lands around Dunfermline after her wedding night. This gift, once given, became the bride's property independent of her husband's holdings. In a world where women owned almost nothing, it was a rare and meaningful asset. But it wasn't always generous. If a groom was displeased, insulted, or disappointed, the morning gift could be meager. A simple brooch, a broken coin, or, in some petty cases, nothing at all. The message was clear: you are mine, but you are not valued. And once given, the gift could not be revoked unless the marriage was annulled. The annulment weapon, ah yes, annulment. The quiet blade hidden in the silk folds of marriage. If a union went unconsummated, either party, usually the bride's family, could appeal for annulment. The reasons? Infidelity, consanguinity. Annulments were messy but common, and expensive. In 1305, Eleanor of Bar's marriage was dissolved after 3 barren years. Her family claimed her husband had no vigor. He, in turn, accused her of sorcery. The church sided with Eleanor. She left with her dowry intact and remarried a younger, richer knight within the year. Annulment wasn't just escape it with strategy. And if you were clever or noble, you could wield it like a sword. When love found a way, despite the pressure, despite the ritual, some couples turned their first night into something more than expectation. In rare letters and quiet ballads, we find whispers of tenderness. A nervous groom placing flowers beneath the pillow, a bride offering honeyed wine to calm her shaking hands, a couple laughing in the dark, choosing not to rush, not to pretend. In a world that demanded performance, a few chose intimacy instead. Not all, but some, and those nights unguarded, uncertain, humans shine brighter than all the crowns and contracts combined. A wedding in the medieval world was not only a union of bloodlines, wealth, or convenience. It was a spectacle of symbols. Symbols that glowed, glittered, or burned. In the smoke-draped corridors of castle chapels and the rain-damp courtyards of peasant parishes, marriage was made visible not just through words or deeds, but through two powerful objects, the torch and the crown. These weren't decorations. They were declarations. To carry a bridal torch was to walk beneath the eyes of God and community as a vessel of life. To wear a bridal crown was to don centuries of tradition, often gold, sometimes painful, always heavy. Let us step into the flickering half-light of medieval matrimony and uncover the strange, stunning truth behind these sacred objects. The torchbearer's procession. Long before electric light, long before gas lamps, the medieval world was illuminated by fire. And so, when a bride moved through her village or down the narrow stone aisles of a church, she was surrounded by flame. Bridal torches long, wax-dripping candles bound in ribbon and herbs were carried by young boys. Maidens, or sometimes older women from the bride's household. These torches served both practical and symbolic purpose. They lit the path ahead and purified it. The flame was thought to ward off evil spirits, ensuring no shadow of misfortune followed the bride to her new life. In some parts of Italy and Provence, the torch procession began at dawn and ended at the church steps. The bride walked behind it in silence, her face veiled, her footsteps measured. And the closer she got to her destination, the more intense the symbolism became. The lead torchbearer would pause and raise the flame, high declaring not just light, but fertility, purity, and divine favor. It was a flickering omen of what she was meant to become. Bearer of heirs, light of the household, keeper of the sacred hearth. In Eastern Europe, a ritual existed where the groom lit a new fire in his hearth on the wedding night using the bridal torch. The bride had to step over it without flinching lest misfortune follow them for 7 years. The fire could never go out on the first night. If it did, so the belief went, so would the love. Flame and purity, a dangerous mix. There were darker sides to this flaming symbol. In rural Germanic communities, it was said that if the bride's veil caught fire as she passed the torchbearers, it was a bad omen, a sign of infidelity to come, or of a childless womb. Stories whispered of a bride in Alsace whose trailing gown brushed the flame. Her scream echoed through the village, her fingers scorched. The marriage failed within the year. Whether through death or divorce, no one remembered. Only the fire remained. These tales weren't just gossip. They were warnings. Purity must be protected, and purity could burn. And so, each torch wasn't merely light, it was threat. And every hand that carried one bore responsibility for the future. The crowning of the bride, if torches purified, the crown sanctified. To be crowned as a bride was to take on not just marital status, but spiritual expectation. The bridal crown was the most visible emblem of maidenhood, virtue, and sacrificial transformation. In noble courts, these crowns were real masterpieces. Gold or silver circlets adorned with pearls, sapphires, or garnets, each stone a symbol. Pearls for purity, sapphires for heaven's blessing, garnets for blood of lineage, of sacrifice. But these were no lightweight ornaments. Some crowns weighed over 5 pounds. Balancing them for the duration of a 3-hour ceremony could be agonizing. Brides were trained weeks in advance, walking with sandbags on their heads, shoulders braced, necks stiffened, all so they could appear composed beneath the burden of glory. In Scandinavia, the bridal crown tradition was so sacred that unmarried mothers or women known to have been touched were forbidden to wear it. Instead, they received a modest wreath of herbs or went uncrowned, their shame made plain to all. This was the church's message, burnished in gold. Virtue is visible. You either carried it on your head or you did not. The crown's curse and blessing, the bridal crown, despite its grandeur, came with tales both divine and damned. In the court of Bohemia, legend tells of a crown once worn by a noblewoman falsely accused of losing her virtue. The heavy gold circlet left bruises on her scalp marks. She claimed were a sign of punishment from God. The rumor persisted that the crown would grow hotter if worn by an impure woman. So feared was this idea that some brides took ritual baths in holy water just before crowning, praying to saints for spiritual protection. Others fasted for days, hoping to purify themselves inwardly before wearing the metal halo. In more rural areas, crowns were passed down through generations, but never before being re-sanctified by a priest. The fear of inherited sin clinging to the circlet was real. And in rare, chilling tales, a crown was buried with its bride should she die before bearing a child. A token to Saint Mary asking for favor in the afterlife. Common brides, earthly crowns, not every bride had gold or gemstones. Among the common folk, the bridal crown took humbler but no less powerful forms. Wreaths of wildflowers woven with rosemary, myrtle, and rue, twisted branches laced with red ribbon, sometimes even crowns made of wheat stalks, symbolizing harvest and fertility. These were worn with pride. They did not glitter, but they meant something. They showed the community this woman had been chosen, was now wife, and was prepared to nurture life. In Slavic villages, after the wedding, the crown was carefully removed and placed on the bride's pillow. There, it remained for the first week of marriage, blessing the bed, guarding the dreams. In some traditions, the groom kissed the crown before the bride, a quiet way of saying, I honor not just your beauty, but your burden. After the flame, after the crown. When the torches burned low and the crown was lifted from the weary head, the bride became something else, a wife. A mistress of a new household, a vessel of hope and expectation. The rituals of fire and gold left their mark, not always seen, but always felt. For medieval women, marriage wasn't just a change of name or home, it was a ritual rebirth. The torches lit the way to it. The crown declared its weight. And if you looked closely past the laughter, past the feasting, past the lace and gold, you could sometimes see it in their eyes. They knew they were stepping into legend. Thus ends Part 6, the story of fire and metal, of purity displayed and duty worn. But now we enter a new realm, where the exchange of goods becomes legal fate, and the transaction of marriage takes a shape as heavy as any crown. A bride walked down the aisle, not just with hope in her heart, but with wealth at her back. In the medieval world, marriage was many things, sacred, strategic, and most of all, transactional. Behind every loving glance and ceremonial kiss was a ledger, a contract, a price tag. Marriage was not only the joining of souls, but the transfer of property. This is the story of dowries and land transfers, where sheep, silver, and soil became the silent witnesses to a couple's fate, and where love was often counted in coin. The dowry defined in modern minds, a dowry sounds old-fashioned, something from fairy tales or tragedy, but in the Middle Ages it was essential. It was the currency of marriage. A dowry dos in Latin was the wealth a bride's family gave to the groom or his kin as part of the marriage agreement. It was more than a gift. It was proof of the bride's value and the family's status. The more powerful the family, the larger the dowry. A noble daughter's dowry might include acres of arable land, herds of cattle or sheep, entire villages and their tax revenues, jewelry, silks, spices, or books, castles. For the merchant class, dowries might consist of coin, ledgers, or portions of trading ships. A cobbler's daughter might bring pigs, grain, or a prize goat. Even peasants negotiated dowries, modest but meaningful, a spinning wheel, a patch of cabbage field, a milk cow, and 2 hens. It was a simple, brutal truth: no dowry, no marriage. In the eyes of the groom's family, a woman without a dowry was a burden, not a blessing. Negotiations and bargains, the dowry wasn't decided on a whim. It was negotiated, often years in advance. Fathers met in candle-lit rooms. Clerks scribbled figures on parchment. Mothers whispered about expectations. Priests, sometimes, were involved not to bless, but to witness. The process was so intricate that some medieval notaries specialized entirely in dowry contracts. These documents were binding, signed, and sealed with wax, sometimes witnessed by as many as 20 individuals. A typical dowry agreement might read, "The maiden Isabeau shall bring to the house of Raymond a chest of silver, 2 cloaks of Spanish wool, 10 goats, and rights to the lower pasture. Should she die childless, the said Raymond shall return said goods. Yes, return. If the marriage failed, or if the bride died without bearing a son, the dowry could be reclaimed." It was a loan with conditions. In this sense, the bride herself became collateral. The dowry chest physical dowries were stored and paraded with pride. A cassone or dowry chest was a common sight in wealthy Italian households. Painted in gold leaf, carved with the bride's initials, these chests were often paraded through the streets before the wedding, followed by servants and musicians. Inside, linens, veils, silks, spice jars, combs, and sometimes books rare and priceless. In Florence, a girl's dowry could equal 2 years of her father's income. In Paris, noblewomen's dowries were so large that kings taxed them separately. In poorer homes, the chest might be smaller, but no less cherished. Mothers passed down combs, thimbles, and crucifixes. Some even sewed messages into the lining, prayers for safety and love. That chest wasn't just storage, it was symbol and inheritance. Land transfers, when love meant borders, dowries weren't only about gold and goods. In the higher echelons of society, they meant land. A noblewoman might bring entire estates to her husband's domain. Villages, vineyards, forests each with peasants who owed taxes and labor. The bride's entry into her new household often expanded its power, sometimes dramatically. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine. When she married King Louis VII, she brought vast lands stretching from the Loire Valley to the Pyrenees. When their marriage ended and she wed Henry II of England, those lands transferred to the English crown, sparking centuries of Anglo-French conflict. One marriage, one dowry. 1,000 nights to war. It wasn't an exception, it was a pattern. Lands changed hands like playing cards, sealed with a bride's trembling signature. Some women, like Matilda of Flanders, never saw the lands they brought to marriage. Others ruled them fiercely. In some cases, brides retained partial control, especially if their dowries were conditional. If mistreated, widowed, or cast aside, they could legally reclaim certain lands. This gave women a rare edge in a world ruled by men, but only if they could prove their worth, the bride's price and the groom's promise in some regions. The groom also paid a fee known as the bride price or Morgengabe. This was distinct from the dowry. It was paid directly to the bride, symbolizing her value as a wife and her future rights. The morning gift was sometimes a single coin, sometimes a necklace, sometimes an entire manor house. This balanced dowry gift return formed the legal backbone of medieval marriage. One brought wealth, the other promised protection, and both were written in ink and blood. Dowry disputes. When love went sour, when marriages soured, and many did, the dowry became a weapon. If a husband abandoned his wife, the family might sue to reclaim her dowry. If a wife ran away, the husband might seize it entirely. Church courts groaned under cases of disputed dowries. Accusations flew: fraud, mismanagement, hidden goods. In one record from 1369, a man in Rouen accused his wife of hiding part of her dowry in her sister's house gold, brooch, and coin hidden beneath floorboards. The court ordered a search. The sister refused. A feud erupted, lasting 10 years, all over a necklace. In poorer communities, dowry theft was a crime akin to kidnapping. Stealing a woman's dowry meant robbing her of safety, marriageability, and survival. Dowry disputes ruined reputations, ruined families, sometimes even sparked blood feuds. When love meant freedom, yet, in rare cases, the dowry freed women. Widows who retained their dowries could manage land, lend money, even build businesses. Some never remarried, not from grief, but from power. A dowry wasn't always a chain. Sometimes it was a key. When love is unspoken, it turns inward. It finds its voice in poetry, in art, and music. And sometimes when duty calls and words can do what feelings cannot, it writes. Love letters, secrets, stolen things. In a world where marriage was duty and alliance, not desire, where affection had to hide, they were a revolution. Carefully folded, coated in poetry, sealed in wax, or slipped into sleeves, these messages defied the strict order of society. They were weapons of intimacy, dangerous, thrilling, often forbidden. In medieval Europe, where public affection was rare and arranged marriage the rule, love letters became the last refuge of real emotion. Respect was paid to social standing, to rank, to wealth. Parents arranged unions to strengthen alliances. Children were betrothed before they could consent. Courtship then was a business transaction, love a luxury. But in this world of rigid rules and stifled emotions, hearts found a way. Lovers met furtively, exchanged shy smiles and stolen touches, and when parting, they poured their feelings onto paper. The earliest surviving love letters from medieval Europe date back to the 11th century. The era of chivalry and courtly love, a world of knights and nobles, of elaborate rituals and unwritten rules. Men were expected to be brave and strong, women demure and yielding. Yet beneath this veneer of decorum, passions ran high. And love, though unspoken, was not absent. But how does one speak of love in a world where emotions are not one's own? How does one confess a heart's desire without risking reputation, social standing, perhaps even life? Enter the love letter. In the 11th century, a French nobleman wrote to his lady, "I dare not call you mine, yet my thoughts are yours. If only I could prove it," he signed it, "your faithful servant." His identity hidden, his emotions veiled behind duty and service. During the High Middle Ages, the 12th and 13th centuries, towns were centers of trade, crafts, and commerce, but also of new ideas and emotions. Here, amidst the hustle and bustle, a new kind of love story unfolded. Town clerks, merchants, and artisans began writing love letters using vernacular languages like French, German, and Italian, giving voice to a new, more intimate kind of love. Across Europe, in England, France, Italy, and Spain, men and women fell in love. And when they could not express their feelings openly, they did so in writing. In 1320, a young woman named Beatrice wrote to her secret love, "Alas, cruel love has pierced my heart." Her words echoed the sentiments of countless others who dared to dream of love beyond duty. These love letters were not mere expressions of affection. They were acts of courage, defiance, and hope. For in a world where love was often unspoken, they gave voice to the emotions that bound two hearts together. But this secret world came with risks. Love letters could be discovered, and when they were, the consequences could be dire. Jealous lovers, protective families, or a meddling clergy could put an end to secret affairs. And yet, despite the risks, they continued to write. Love letters from the late Middle Ages, the 14th and 15th centuries, reflect a changing world. The Black Death had ravaged Europe, killing millions and altering the course of history. As society grappled with profound loss, themes of death and mortality permeated art, literature, and yes, love letters. Writers like Geoffrey Chaucer explored these themes in works like the Canterbury Tales, where characters like the wife of Bath shared tales of love and loss in a world forever changed. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, so too did the era of the secret love letter. The Renaissance brought new ideas about love and relationships, and with the advent of printing, new ways of communicating. Yet, despite their disappearance from everyday life, love letters continued to capture the hearts and minds of writers and poets. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, for instance, sealed their love with a letter, just as Beatrice and Benedict did before them. Most medieval love letters are now lost, destroyed in the passage of time, or by those who sought to silence the voices within them. But those that survive offer us a glimpse into a world where love, though often unspoken, was never absent. They remind us that even in the most restrictive of societies, the human spirit yearns for connection, for understanding, and for love. When a husband died, ritual ruled everything. The widow dressed in black or deep blue or dull gray, depending on region and rank. Her head was covered, her face hidden. In noble households, she was expected to wail publicly, to collapse theatrically at the bier, to pray loudly at the funeral mass. In private, however, her mourning followed strict rules. In France and England, she was expected to grieve in seclusion for a year and a day. This period was known as the widow's year or annus luctus. During this time, she could not remarry nor appear without her veil. She often fasted on Fridays and made charitable donations in her husband's name. But beneath the sorrow, something ancient stirred. For after that year passed, she emerged changed. She was no longer maiden nor bride, she was matron, and in many cases, mistress of her own fate. The dower right, her share of the earth unlike a dowry, which a bride brought into marriage. A dower was what she received after her husband's death, and it wasn't a gift, it was law. The church and crown alike upheld a widow's right to a portion of her husband's estate, usually 1/3. This might include lands, homes, livestock, servants, and income. She was entitled to it for life, regardless of whether her husband's heirs liked it or not. In noble houses, this made her a landed lady, suddenly in control of men, money, and matters of law. She could lease property, collect rent, sponsor artisans, and even summon knights to defend her borders. Imagine, a woman once forbidden from speaking at a feast now presiding over tenants, reviewing ledgers, signing contracts with her own seal. In Kent, England, some widows managed manors with dozens of laborers. In Burgundy, widows of merchants took over entire trading operations. In Venice, widows sat as heads of household guilds. Grief may have bent them, but it did not break them. Veil or vengeance. Widows in court, some widows quietly accepted their dower and faded into chapel life. Others did not. A widow could sue her in-laws if they withheld property. She could contest the will. She could appear before bishops, justices, even kings, and when she did not bow. She stood. In 1318, Lady Isabelle de Marnay of Aquitaine filed suit against her husband's nephew for hiding grain stores meant to fund her widow's household. She won and doubled her claim in damages. In London, widows were frequent presences in court rolls. They filed for theft, slander, trespass, breach of contract. Some appeared so often that scribes abbreviated their names in shorthand. Widowhood for many was not a retreat, it was a campaign. When widows ruled, some widows became regents, ruling entire regions until their sons came of age. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, widowed twice, and ruling longer than either of her husbands. Or Blanche of Castile, who governed France with iron clarity while her son Louis IX waged war abroad. Even in smaller fiefdoms, widows commanded respect. They negotiated marriages for their daughters. They arranged alliances. Some oversaw castle defenses, writing instructions to garrisons, rationing food, and managing sieges. These women were not tokens of loss. They were architects of survival, and while many feared them superstitions calling widows cursed, dangerous, even unholy, they persisted because their power was earned. The stigma of the merry widow, yet freedom bred suspicion. The longer a widow remained unmarried, the more dangerous she was perceived to be. Why? Because she answered to no man. Whispers followed them. Were they seductresses? Sorceresses? Was their mourning sincere or performed? The church preached against excessive vanity in widows. Sermons warned of the painted face of the lustful widow, leading young men into ruin. In taverns, songs joked about the merry widow who poisoned her husband and danced upon his grave. In courts, some widows faced accusations of witchcraft, especially those who prospered or lived alone. But most were simply clever. They had learned the truth, that love could be a leash, and loss, an opening. Widowhood and remarriage. Some widows did remarry, but on their own terms. A second marriage for a widow came with new leverage. She could keep her dower from the first husband while negotiating better terms with the second. Many refused to bring another dowry, forcing the groom to pay her instead. A powerful widow could attract ambitious men, but she was no girl to be courted. She was a negotiator. In Italy, marriage contracts of widows often included escape clauses, limits on male control, or pre-agreed inheritance for children from the first marriage. They had learned what to demand. They had suffered. They had survived. The cloistered alternative for some widows, especially in noble or pious families, the only acceptable route was retirement into a convent. There they donned veils again, not for mourning, but for service to God. Some truly sought peace. Others were pushed, hidden away by families eager to reclaim their lands or avoid scandal. Yet even there, some rose to power, becoming abbesses with command over vast properties and dozens of nuns. In sacred silence they governed, and in prayer they remembered A life rewritten in medieval eyes, the ideal woman was a virgin, a wife, or a mother. But the widow, she was none of those. She was the fourth figure, the wild card, feared, respected, envied, and she moved through the world in black robes, with sharp eyes and the keys to her own fate jangling at her side. Alright, let's talk about sex. Well, actually, let's talk about marriage, specifically a kind of marriage that sounds like a joke, but isn't. I'm talking about a wedding where the bride wears black. Black like the clothes worn by a member of the clergy, because in this case, the bride is the widow of the groom. See, in some corners of medieval Europe and beyond, a woman was not released by her husband's death. Instead, she was passed to his brother. And sometimes in reverse, a groom was passed to the sister of his dead wife. This was not scandal. It was custom. This is the strange, shadowy tale of levirate and sorate marriage, where family lines, inheritance, and duty overpowered grief, and the line between love and law blurred dangerously close. Let's start with levirate marriage, a term that comes from the Latin word levire, meaning husband's brother. Now, you might have heard of levirate marriages from Game of Thrones, where a widow was forced to marry her deceased husband's brother. But this fictional scenario has deep roots in reality. Levirate marriage was common throughout history and across cultures, and it appears in ancient law. Think the Code of Hammurabi, the Bible, and even the Koran. But today we're focusing on medieval Europe, where levirate customs endured long after the church called them sinful. And why was that? Because feudal society was all about the bloodline. Property and titles passed through pure lineage, and a dead man's heirs still needed to be born. So if a man died without children, his wife was expected to bear him sons. You can see how this system incentivized levirate marriage. If a man died, his brother could marry the widow to ensure the continuation of the family line and the preservation of their land and wealth. Also, this marriage wasn't seen as scandalous. In fact, it was considered a duty, a kind of service the brother owed to his sibling and the family name. Can you imagine how awkward those family gatherings must have been? How uncomfortable the dinners? Having to call your spouse's brother by a term of endearment, only to think, well, actually we're more than brother and sister. This custom led to some pretty complicated relationships. For instance, if a husband died, his brother might have been his best friend, someone he shared secrets with, confided in, laughed with. And then suddenly that brother becomes your husband. It's almost like a Greek tragedy waiting to happen. Now, these unions weren't always happy. The bride might have been mourning the loss of her husband, dealing with complicated feelings of love, grief, guilt, confusion. And suddenly she's expected to move on, to forget her dead husband and accept her new one. But it wasn't just about the bride. How do you think the grooms felt? The men who were expected to take up the mantle, the bed, the widow. Some were eager for the union, seeing it as an opportunity to advance their social standing, increase their wealth, secure their bloodline. But others resisted. They argued with their families, negotiated, bargained, tried to avoid the marriage. But ultimately, they couldn't escape their duty. In the end, the pressure to conform, the weight of family expectations, the desire for social advancement, it all pushed these marriages forward. Levirate marriage may sound like a relic of the past, a bizarre footnote in history. But the truth is, it resonates with modern issues of inheritance, family pressure, gender roles, and the complexities of human relationships. It's a reminder of how our past continues to shape our present, and how the line between love and duty is often blurred. Coming up next week, there's going to be an episode on sorate marriage, which is very closely linked to levirate marriage, but sort of flips the script. It's a fascinating look at the world of medieval marriage. Don't miss it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the channel, please subscribe. Hello friends. Today's video is about the word divorce. Do you think this word belongs to the modern era? Think again. We will take you back in time to the dark and gloomy medieval period to see how people escaped their unhappy marriages. Make sure to watch till the end to know more. As always, the show begins with the bell ringing, the vows being read, the witnesses smiling. But somewhere behind the high castle walls or in the village square, the silence between husband and wife deepens. Marriage in the medieval world was considered eternal. Once bound, the union was sealed. By law, by church, by God. But what if it broke? What if the love was false, the consummation failed, or the alliance soured? There were no easy exits. There was no such thing as divorce, not in the way we know it. Instead, there were annulments rare, complex, expensive, and when those weren't possible, there were scandals. This is the story of what happened when medieval marriages came undone, how couples begged bishops, bribed popes, or burned reputations to escape their unions. No divorce-only escape in most of medieval Europe, particularly in Catholic countries. Divorce did not exist. Marriage was a sacrament, a divine contract. To break it was to offend the heavens themselves. The Church offered no legal path to end a valid marriage. You could separate, yes, live apart, refuse the bed. Even wage war through lawyers, but the marriage remained. The only real way out, annulment. An annulment was not a medieval divorce. It was something far stranger. It didn't end a marriage, it declared it had never legally existed. To get one, you had to prove that the marriage had been invalid from the start. There were only a few approved reasons. Consanguinity. You were too closely related, sometimes as distant as third cousins. Impotence. The union had not and could not be consummated. Fraud or coercion. One party had been tricked or forced. Pre-existing marriage. One partner was already married. Clerical error. A priest married you improperly. The process was long, humiliating, and deeply public. Witnesses were summoned. Sheets examined. Confessions dragged into the open. In 1303, Lady Amicia of Devon sought annulment on the grounds that her husband had never touched her nor shown interest in the female form. Her servants testified. Her midwife confirmed. After 3 years of hearings, the Church granted her freedom, but not all were so lucky, and some turned instead to lies. The convenient cousin clause of all the reasons, consanguinity was the most abused. Canon law forbade marriages within 7 degrees of relation, a calculation so broad that most nobles were technically cousins. If a couple later wished to separate, they would suddenly discover a shared ancestor. A count might claim his wife was descended from the same knight in the time of Charlemagne. A merchant's son might find a long-lost family tree to justify annulment. Sometimes these claims were true. Often they were not. But in a time without DNA or centralized records, all it took was a few witnesses and a cooperative priest. Thus, bloodlines became weapons. Money and influence. The hidden keys for the wealthy and well-connected. Annulments were easier. Popes could be petitioned. Bishops could be bribed. Canon lawyers could be hired to discover loopholes. King Louis VII of France famously annulled his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152 on the grounds of consanguinity despite 15 years of marriage and 2 daughters. Days later, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, soon to be King of England. Coincidence? Hardly. Her lands transferred from France to England, triggering decades of war. The annulment was not theology. It was politics. Separation without freedom for commoners, escape was harder. If a woman fled an abusive husband, she was rarely protected. She might be labeled unfaithful. Her children declared illegitimate, her dowry seized. Still, some did leave, vanishing into convents, remarrying under false names, or claiming spiritual vows to avoid return. In rare cases, women appealed to bishops for separation from bed and board. This allowed them to live apart from their husbands, but not remarry. It was legal limbo. One record from York in 1389 describes Agnes of Weller requesting such a separation because her husband beat her thrice a week and kept a mistress in their bed. The bishop agreed, but her property stayed with him. She lived alone in poverty. Her freedom came at a cost. When scandal ruled the court, not all broken marriages ended with parchment. Some ended in public ruin. Affairs, poisonings, accusations of sorcery. When marriages went bad in the noble class, they often became theater. The Countess of Shrewsbury in 1447 was accused of seducing her page boy and plotting her husband's murder. She was arrested, her servants tortured, and her marriage dissolved by royal decree. Whether the accusations were true or politically motivated, the result was clear: exile. In France, tales abounded of bored noblewomen seducing priests or husbands taking lovers from among the servants. When discovered, the punishments were brutal imprisonment, flogging, or enforced pilgrimage. Even queens weren't safe. Isabella of Angoulême, wife of King John of England, was rumored to have taken multiple lovers after his death. Though never proven, the rumors followed her to her grave, sainted, but not heard. The role of the church held the keys to marriage and the locks. Bishops presided over annulments. Monks copied court records. Priests were often called to testify having married the couple, heard their confessions, or observed their household. Yet the church was also often complicit in the politics of annulment. In 1498, Louis XII of France sought to annul his marriage to Joan of France, citing her malformation and his own impotence. The church granted it despite evidence that the marriage had been consummated. He married Anne of Brittany days later, securing his kingdom's expansion. Joan became a nun. She was later canonized. Behind every annulment or scandal was a human story of betrayal, disappointment, pain. A woman forced to testify that her husband never touched her. A man accused of being less than a man before his peers. A child declared illegitimate because a priest made an error 15 years earlier. These were not just legal cases. They were lives. And they remind us that love in the medieval world was rarely private. It belonged to the church, the law, the family, and the whispers of those who watched. Thus ends Part 11. A tale of undone vows, secret petitions, and the dangerous business of saying, "I no longer." Stay tuned for more historical tales. Until next time, farewell. Far from the cathedral spires, beyond the reach of bishops and courts, another kind of wedding unfolded. It was not written in Latin or sealed with wax. It was not conducted before clergy or backed by land deeds. There were no crowns, no dowries, no papal dispensations. Instead, there were circles drawn in earth, flowers braided into hair, hands joined beneath moonlight, fires lit, oaths whispered. These were the folk marriages. The pagan customs, the ancient rites that lived on in the hills, the forests, the meadows passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, from hearth to harvest field. This is the story of love beyond the church. When we think of medieval marriage, we imagine grand ceremonies. We see the bride in flowing gown and veil, the groom in finery, the banquet, the band, the blessing of the priest. But for 9 out of 10 couples, their wedding would have been very different. Far from the grandeur of kings and queens, for most people there was no feast, no musician, no formal rite. Their marriage was a simple exchange of consent, a joining of lives, blessed by nature, by community, by themselves. And that was enough. The handfasting ceremony in the far reaches of Britain, Ireland, and the Norse-influenced Isles. Marriage could take the form of a ritual called handfasting. A man and woman stood facing one another. Their hands right to right, then left to left, were bound together with ribbon, cord, or woven grass. Sometimes it was the bride's hair, sometimes her mother's girdle. The bond was physical and symbolic. They were literally tied together, a custom that gave birth to the modern phrase, tying the knot. Words were spoken, often in rhyming verse. No priest was required, only witnesses. Sometimes none at all. A popular variation allowed for a year-and-a-day trial marriage. If, after that time, the couple still wished to remain together, they would renew their vows. If not, they parted, no shame, no scandal. The church hated this. They called it marriage of the left hand, a sign of informal, inferior union. But to villagers and clansfolk it was just as sacred as any Latin rite, because it came from the earth. Sacred sites and seasons folk weddings often took place outdoors on sacred hills, near ancient stones, or at riverbanks where local spirits were said to dwell. Spring and summer were favored seasons, especially the festival of Beltane. May 1st, when fertility rites reached their peak, young couples leapt over bonfires together, their joined hands a sign of unity and courage. In some regions, newlyweds lay in fields of grain to bless the harvest with their union. Others danced around maypoles, long wooden poles, symbolizing the masculine wrapped with ribbons by the feminine. These weren't symbols of vulgarity, they were celebrations of life. Even after conversion to Christianity, these customs endured. Priests railed against the licentious dancing of the green, but villagers kept dancing. Because these marriages belonged to the cycle of nature, not the hierarchy of Rome. The role of the wise woman in the absence of a priest who blessed the marriage. Often it was the cunning woman, the village healer, or the midwife, those who held ancient knowledge of herbs, charms, and birth. She would anoint the couple's foreheads with lavender or mugwort, burn juniper to cleanse the space, sprinkle water from sacred wells over their joined hands. In some cases, she would recite incantations older than Christianity. As the moon waxes, so may your love grow. As the wheat ripens, so may your bond bear fruit. To the church, such women were suspect witches, heretics, heathens. But to the people, they were essential. They held the memory of old gods and unwritten rites. Symbols and charms, every object in a folk wedding carried meaning. Rowan branches were worn to ward off evil. Acorns were hidden in clothing to bring strength and longevity. Salt circles were drawn around the couple to keep out spirits of jealousy or barrenness. A bride might carry a stone warmed in the hearth, wrapped in cloth, to symbolize the shared fire of the new household. In parts of Scandinavia, brides wove runic charms into their veils or garters, asking the spirits to protect their wombs and their homes. In Slavic regions, the groom's path to the bride was deliberately blocked by family members who demanded riddles, gifts, or songs. This mock resistance was a test of cleverness, generosity, and worth. These customs might seem strange, but they served a purpose. They bound communities, just as surely as contracts in cathedrals. Love and freedom in folk marriage, love was more than allowed, it was essential. Unlike arranged noble marriages, many folk unions were based on mutual affection. Parents might advise or guide but rarely force. The girl could refuse, the boy could wait. Elopement was not uncommon. Two young lovers might disappear into the woods during a festival. Returning days later, hand-fasted under a tree or stone. Were they judged? Sometimes. But more often they were welcomed back with laughter, bread, and ale. Because the village needed children and love was life's engine, not scandal, not sin. When the church came knocking over centuries, the church sought to bring these customs under control. They outlawed handfasting, declared outdoor weddings invalid, threatened excommunication for those married without a priest's blessing, but enforcement was difficult. In rural villages, the bishop's reach was weak. The village priest was often a local boy himself, familiar with the old ways. He might perform a church ceremony after the couple had already lived together for months. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council demanded public bans and formal rites for all marriages. But even a century later, reports from the English countryside described couples still marrying by moon and hedge. The old ways did not die easily. They lived in secret, in song, in habit. Echoes in modern times, many of these folk customs survived into later centuries and beyond. Handfasting is still practiced in neo-pagan and Celtic weddings today. Jumping the broom, a folk marriage rite among enslaved African peoples and poor Europeans, continues in weddings across the world. Tying of hands, garter games, and flower crowns all trace their roots to these ancient ceremonies. And even now, the idea that marriage is more than contract, that it is ritual, nature, and love remains deeply human. In the vast halls of medieval life, where duties intertwined with lineage and marriages were bonds of obligation, where did love reside? Was it a mere whisper lost in the echoes of arranged unions? Or was it an anthem sung by secret glances and unspoken desires? Today, we'll journey back in time to explore a realm where love dared to bloom. Amidst the rigid customs and traditions of the Middle Ages, we'll uncover a world where love was not a transaction, but a transformative experience. Marriage in the Middle Ages was a multifaceted institution. It was duty, property, lineage. But was it love? Love had its own stage? It thrived in verses passed between silk-gloved hands, in secret glances across a crowded hall, in a hand touched too long at a tournament. and a name whispered in the chapel when no one else was watching. This was courtly love, a peculiar invention of the medieval imagination. Passion without possession. Desire without consummation, or so the poets claimed. For in a world where marriage was arranged, sealed, and unromantic, courtly love offered something dangerous and delicious, a separate sphere, a parallel world of longing, one with its own rules, its own language, and often its own heartbreak. Courtly love found its birthplace not in churches or courts of law, but in the courts of poetry, specifically in 12th century southern France. There, in the sun-warmed lands of Aquitaine and Provence, troubadours, wandering poet-musicians sang of a love so refined, so elevated, it was practically holy. Their verses told of knights who pledged their hearts to noble ladies offering married ladies offering loyalty, service, and adoration, all from a distance. Because while the church sanctified marital duty and childbearing, these poets sanctified desire. The lady on the pedestal in courtly love, the woman was not the property of the man. She was his superior. She commanded. He obeyed. She tested him with silence, glances, riddles. He proved himself with bravery, patience, and suffering. Her favor, a handkerchief, a smile, was the highest reward. Sometimes the lady was real, a queen, a duchess, a noblewoman trapped in a loveless marriage. Other times she was a symbol of virtue, of beauty, of impossible yearning. In all cases she remained unattainable, but the impossibility was the point. Because courtly love was about feeling, not fulfillment, about eternal yearning, not brief pleasure. It was, in many ways, love as religion. The code of the courtly love had rules, dozens of them. Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century writer, even listed them in his Art of Courtly Love. Among them, marriage is no excuse for not loving. He who is not jealous cannot love. No one should be deprived of love without a valid reason. A lover is always fearful. It was a game, a ritual, a performance. And yet, behind the performance, something real often stirred. Many troubadours fell in love for real, and some noble ladies responded. What began in poetry ended in passion. And passion in a medieval marriage was rarely allowed. Love in the halls of power, courtly love, was not just for dreamers. It lived in the highest places. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in Europe, was a patron of troubadours. Her court became a center of this romantic tradition. Her daughter, Marie of Champagne, turned it into doctrine, hosting debates on the nature of love, judging whether lovers had acted nobly or not. Knights swore oaths of loyalty to ladies they would never touch. Some wore their colors into battle, tying ribbons to their lances, declaring themselves servants of love. And queens, clever, politically trapped queens, used courtly love to gather influence, manipulate rivals, and shape their world through the softest form of rebellion. Because in a court of arranged unions and cold alliances, being adored was power. When love crossed the line, not all courtly love remained chaste. In some cases, the passion ignited by poetry led to real affairs. Letters survived between knights and noblewomen filled with coded declarations. Desperate pleas and confessions that would have brought ruin if discovered. Some lovers were careful. Others were caught. In 1399, a French noblewoman and her husband Esquire were discovered after a servant found a torn love letter tucked beneath a tapestry. The squire was imprisoned. The woman, forced to take a vow of chastity, retired to a convent. The church watched these relationships with suspicion. Bishops condemned them as the devil's flattery, but they could not stop them, because people kept falling in love. Despite everything, a world of mirrors. Courtly love was not just romance, it was mirrored life. Marriage was about control. Courtly love was about freedom. Marriage was public, courtly love was secret. Marriage demanded heirs. Courtly love demanded nothing but feeling. This duality reflected the deep emotional starvation of noble life. Women and men alike were often married off in childhood, chained to alliances, stuck in roles. Courtly love allowed them to imagine another life, one where they chose, one where their hearts mattered, even if only in song. From the lyric to the page, courtly love spilled from verse into fiction. In the stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, of Tristan and Isolde, the tradition took legendary form. Here were knights torn between honor and love, ladies tempted by passion but loyal to duty, lovers cursed by fate, punished by kings, yet remembered forever. These were not happy endings, but they were true, and they spoke to generations who longed for more than duty. They whispered, "You are not alone." The legacy courtly love faded as the medieval world gave way to Renaissance realism, but its influence lingered. You can see it in Shakespeare's sonnets, in tales of star-crossed lovers, in the way we still equate love with suffering, in the idea that longing pure, poetic longing is the highest expression of romance, and you can feel it every time someone loves without hope. Because courtly love never truly died. It simply moved into the shadows, where it had always belonged. The torches had long burned out. The guests were asleep or stumbling home. The feast had turned to silence. And in the hush of morning, something more delicate and more dangerous began. It was the morning after the wedding, a celebration of love, right? Wrong, for our story doesn't end with the ceremony, the dance, or even the bedding. It ends the next day in daylight when proof was demanded. Not proof of love, not even happiness, but of honor. In the Middle Ages, the morning after the wedding night was a moment of intense scrutiny. The bride was the main event. If the marriage had not been consummated, it was considered unfinished. In some regions and classes, that meant it was not even legally valid. And so, the dawn became a kind of quiet verdict. Was the marriage sealed? Was the bride still intact? Was the honor of the families maintained? Some noble households left nothing to imagination. Servants checked bedsheets for blood. Midwives stood by to examine the bride. In courts, especially royal ones, the morning after became an official matter watched, witnessed, sometimes even recorded. In extreme cases, this event was public. In 15th century France, one noble groom was accompanied into the bedchamber by a group of higher-ranking witnesses. They did not stay for the act, but waited just outside, ready to be shown the linens. For these families, honor was visible, and it was stained in red. In other courts, a small jury of women inspected the sheets for any sign of penetration. If the bride was deemed impure, there could be hell to pay. In 1345, Isabella of Bavaria found herself under scrutiny after her marriage to the heir to the Holy Roman Empire. Rumors spread that she was refusing her conjugal duties. After a long investigation and 3 separate gynecological exams, she was cleared of any wrongdoing, but not without damage to her reputation. But the fuss wasn't just about sex. The concern was also about pregnancy. Remember, marriage was not just about love, it was about production. A child born out of wedlock could be an economic and social disaster. And while we may think of birth control as a modern concept, medieval couples certainly weren't careless about preventing pregnancy. It's very likely that barrier methods like diaphragms or sponges were used, though few remain from this time period. Still, the Church frowned upon any mention of contraception, casting suspicion on women whose marriages appeared unconsummated. So let's get back to that quiet verdict, shall we? What happened if the bride failed the test? First, the failed consummation could open up the marriage contract. In some regions, the groom could be forced to pay back the bride's dowry. In others, the woman could return to her family with a hefty financial settlement. So, if the wedding night ended without penetration, it wasn't necessarily game over, but it wasn't great either. If the bride was found impure, she could be cast out, sometimes with public shaming. And if the groom was deemed impotent, he could be sued for damages. So how did couples navigate this pressure cooker situation? Well, sometimes women simply offered themselves up for inspection. The more generous husbands provided written guarantees of their wife's virginity, and the wealthier brides showed up to the wedding with a chaperone to guard the bedroom. But really, it was just another example of how medieval marriage was a bizarre combination of intimacy and investment, romance and record-keeping, love and logistics. But we promised you a happy ending. How could we forget the gift, the morning gift or Morgengab? Unlike the dowry, which came from the bride's family, the morning gift was given by the husband, directly to his new wife the morning after their first union. It could take many forms: a jewel, a ring, a parcel of land, a manor, a promise of future income, or, in royal cases, entire cities or estates. This gift served multiple purposes. It was a reward, a legal acknowledgement, and in some cases, a contract of protection. By giving a morning gift, the husband declared, "This woman is mine, this marriage is complete, and I honor her." The gift was usually formalized in writing. In some traditions, it was witnessed. In others, it was secretly presented only between husband and wife. But always it marked a shift. The woman was no longer a bride, she was now a wife, with rights, and the morning gift was hers alone. In a society where most women owned nothing, this could be critical. If her husband died, the gift remained hers. If she was widowed early, it became her security. In fact, in many noble families, the morning gift served as a reverse dowry, not just payment for the marriage, but a pledge of protection. A noblewoman might receive an estate with income-producing tenants, a town's toll rights, or a castle with its own garrison. Records from 13th century Denmark describe a queen receiving the lands of Roskilde and all rights therein, for the price of her dignity and the sanctity of her bed. Some morning gifts became legendary. Eleanor of Castile, queen to Edward I of England, received numerous castles and estates, many of which she managed independently. Upon her death, Edward ordered the construction of crosses at every place her body rested during its procession, a sign not just of grief, but respect for the wife he honored in life. A gesture not always equal, but the morning gift was not guaranteed. A disappointed or disgraced husband might refuse to give one, or offer a paltry token and insult in the language of silver and stone. In such cases, the woman could suffer humiliation. Her status would be diminished. Whispers might circulate that the marriage had failed, or worse, that she had failed. In these moments, the power imbalance was laid bare. A gift withheld was a judgment made. And yet, clever women learned to negotiate better gifts in advance sometimes as part of the marriage contract itself. Wealthy brides could leverage their dowries in exchange for a larger morning gift. Others demanded legal guarantees, sealed documents protecting their rights. In a world built on alliances, even tenderness had a price. Next time you wake up in the morning after, well, just remember, it could have been a whole lot worse. You could have been in the Middle Ages. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. And remember, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm here to talk about medieval marriage. Today we're going to start at the beginning, the ceremony itself. No matter where it took place in Europe, every wedding began with a contract. Marriage in the Middle Ages was a bond sanctified by the church, witnessed by society, and governed by law. For women, it was often described as a surrender, a passing from the protection of father to the control of husband. And in many ways, that was true. A wife could not vote, could not attend university, and in most places, could not testify in court without a man's approval. But the story was not so simple. Because within this rigid framework, women, especially wives, found power, not always loudly, not always directly, but in contracts, customs, and cleverness, they carved out space to act, to own, to influence. This is the story of the legal rights of medieval wives, how they navigated a world that tied their hands, but didn't always silence them. In the Middle Ages, a wedding contract wasn't just about love. It was about land and lineage, money and power. And women were key players. Take the dowry, for example. This was money or property brought into a marriage by a bride. It was her stake in the union, and trust me, we're going to come back to that. Then there was the issue of consent. In canon and civil law, marriage required the free consent of both parties. Now, this wasn't exactly democratic. Consent often meant agreement to an advantageous match, not necessarily love. But it did mean that a woman could take her father or guardian to court if she was forced into a union against her will. And then there were the witnesses. In most medieval cultures, 3 was the magic number. 2 represented the man and 2 represented the woman. They could be relatives, friends, clergy members, or even neighbors. Their signatures legitimized the bond. And for women, having a robust network of witnesses was vital. They offered protection, especially in cases of abuse or if a marriage fell apart. So, a woman entering wedlock would have thought carefully about who stood beside her. Finally, there was the ceremony itself. It was normally held in a church, but it wasn't inside. Most churches didn't have walls, just a roof. and weddings were major community events. Imagine a giant party with feasting and dancing, music and games, with townspeople, tradesmen, and neighbors all invited. In short, marriage was a public affair, and while it marked the beginning of a new legal status for women, it wasn't a solitary journey. They had networks, they had allies, and they had laws not perfect, not equal, but sometimes surprisingly strong. Wives had rights, but the big question was how to use them. You see, in medieval law, marriage was more than a union, it was a legal transformation. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity became covered by her husband. In English common law, this was called coverture, the idea that the wife and husband were one legal person, and that person was the husband. A married woman known in law as a femme covert could not independently own property, enter contracts, or sue in her own name. But this wasn't universal. In many parts of Europe, especially in urban centers like Paris, Florence, and Bruges, local customs or civic laws gave wives more leverage. And even within coverture, there were exceptions. Let's explore them. One of the most important protections for married women was the dower, legal right to a portion of her husband's property upon his death. Typically, it was 1/3 of the husband's estate. This land or income could not be sold without her consent. And if she outlived her husband, she could keep her dower for life. In theory, it gave wives significant bargaining power within marriage, as well as security after a spouse's death. Another safeguard was separate property or paraphernalia. That's the stuff a woman brought to the marriage and owned in her own right. This might have included jewelry, clothes, furniture, or even income-generating assets. Importantly, her husband couldn't touch this property without her consent, and upon her death, it passed according to her will or to her heirs. Then there were business-owning wives. In cities and towns across Europe, a wife could run a shop or business, either alongside her husband or independently, especially if he was away on business. And in some cases, she was legally recognized as a femme sole trader. This meant that she could enter contracts, manage property, and represent herself in court. But what if a marriage went wrong? Well, the medieval church offered some recourse. Canon law stated that a marriage was invalid if it was coerced. So a woman who was forced into marriage could have it annulled. And if a marriage was abusive or neglectful, a wife could petition for a legal separation. Granted, this didn't end the marriage, but it did allow her to live separately and often to keep part of her husband's estate. Finally, some women simply chose to write things down. They drafted wills managing the distribution of their property. They wrote letters asserting control over their correspondence. And they kept records, serving as scribes and record keepers for their households. In a world that told them to be silent, some women found their voices on the page. The bride sat resplendent in her finery, waiting for the groom. No, here, read that again. The bride sat resplendent in her finery, waiting for the groom, a man she had never laid eyes on. For in this tale of arranged nuptials, the groom was a world away, his presence symbolized by a sword placed upon a cushion at the altar. Welcome to my channel. Today we are getting married, sort of. You see, in the grand halls of medieval diplomacy, marriage was not always a matter of candles, cathedrals, or clasped hands. Sometimes it was paper. Sometimes the bride and groom were worlds apart, their wedding arranged not in ballads or whispered promises, but in scrolls, seals, and cold negotiations. This was the case with the marriage of a young noblewoman named Elizabeth to a mysterious suitor named Godfrey. They had been betrothed by their families without so much as a glance between them, their future union sealed with a contract rather than a kiss. On the day of their wedding, Elizabeth arrived at the church adorned in silk and velvet, a vision of feminine beauty. All eyes were on her as she made her way to the altar. At the other end stood a figure cloaked in black, his face obscured by a hood. With a slight nod to the assembled company, he knelt before the altar. As the priest approached, he slowly rose, revealing not a man at all, but a woman in disguise, Elizabeth's older brother. He was her proxy, standing in her place at the ceremony. He answered the priest's questions in a low voice, his tone betraying none of the thoughts that may have been racing through his head. With a solemn oath, he pledged his support and fealty to their unknown sibling, uniting them in holy matrimony. Once the ceremony was over, Elizabeth's brother removed his disguise, revealing the face of a man who, though he loved his sister dearly, harbored resentment toward her for being thrust into a marriage bed on the other side of the continent. He departed soon after, leaving Elizabeth alone in a church now echoing with the emptiness of her situation. Now, this was a common occurrence during the Middle Ages, a time when marriage was as much a political tool as a means of uniting two hearts. But how did this union affect the lives of those involved? How did they cope with the bizarre circumstances of their marriage? And what were the consequences of a marriage conducted in such an unconventional manner? Let us delve deeper. Elizabeth's brother had fulfilled his duty, but now he would be gone for months, if not years. Her new husband, Godfrey, was, after all, a ruler of a distant land, and he would not be returning home anytime soon. Elizabeth found herself alone in a grand house, attended by servants but cut off from the world. Her only connection to her husband, a single ring that glinted on her finger like a constant reminder of her peculiar situation. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still there was no sign of Godfrey. The people of the region whispered about the strange marriage, and Elizabeth found herself the subject of gossip and speculation. Was her husband a monster, a pauper, or perhaps a long-forgotten illegitimate son of a king? Each passing day brought new rumors and fresh anxieties to Elizabeth's doorstep. Meanwhile, across the miles, her brother grappled with his own demons. He was now lord and lady to a shadowy figure whose existence was a mystery. He pored over letters and reports from his sister's lands, trying to piece together a portrait of the person to whom he was supposedly married. Did they love him? Did they hate him? Were they kind, cruel, intelligent, or vapid? He had no answers. Only the hollow echo of a wedding ceremony that had united them in a bond neither had asked for. Now, their story is not unique. Throughout history, marriages were arranged for political gain, to forge alliances, or to cement power structures. In some cases, the spouses were strangers, thrown together by the whims of fate and the machinations of their families. But in others, there was a genuine desire to unite two people from different corners of the world, to create a bond that transcended physical distance. Theirs is a tale as old as time itself, a testament to the lengths to which people will go for love, duty, and the pursuit of happiness. Will they find it in each other? Only time will tell. So stay tuned for more updates. The bride had died. The land still needed a mistress. The children still needed a mother, and so he married again. Sometimes for comfort, sometimes for politics, often for necessity. But what followed wasn't always peace. Because in the medieval world, a new wife often entered not a home but a battlefield, where children from a first marriage eyed her with suspicion, where her own children, born later, became rivals, where land, title, and loyalty were currency, and nothing, not even blood, was sacred. This is the story of stepfamilies in the Middle Ages, blended households where alliances were fragile. Inheritance was everything, and betrayal often came from within. A second wife in an age of plague, war, and childbirth mortality, second marriages were common especially for men. If a nobleman lost his wife, remarriage was often swift. He needed heirs, he needed order, and in the absence of emotions, marriage was a solution. But for the children of his first marriage, this second wife, often younger, unfamiliar, ambitious, was a threat. Would she love them, ignore them, replace them? And most importantly, would she have children of her own? Children who would grow up alongside them, but not as equals. Blood vs. marriage medieval inheritance laws were a labyrinth of customs, oaths, and regional codes. But in most systems, whether feudal England, Capetian France, or German duchies, bloodline was paramount. The eldest son inherited. The first wife's children, if legitimate, held priority. But if the father favored the second wife or her sons, he might try to redistribute his lands or manipulate the succession. This created civil wars of the household. Daughters feared being passed over for new sons. Sons feared being disinherited. Stepmothers feared being cast out when their husbands died. And so, under the same roof, factions formed. A war of rooms and corridors in manor houses and castles, these tensions were not just legal, They were physical. The first wife's children often kept their own quarters, governed by loyal retainers or servants loyal to her memory. The second wife might install her own household, governesses, maids, and tutors sympathetic to her bloodline. Meals became measured. Glances became cold. Resources like clothes, tutors, or even hunting rights became bargaining chips. There are accounts from 14th century Burgundy of children refusing to dine with their stepmother or openly challenging her authority in front of guests. One noble boy reportedly spat into his stepbrother's porridge, declaring, "You eat from what you stole." These were not just childish quarrels. They were preludes to war. Stepmothers and their reputation in medieval literature and folklore, stepmothers were cast as villains. They were the schemers, the poisoners, the ones who plotted behind doors while sons slept unaware. Fairy tales echoed these fears, Snow White, Cinderella, Hansel, and Gretel, all born from a cultural truth. People feared the second wife because she had motive, and sometimes she had means. In real life, there are documented cases of stepmothers accused of sabotaging firstborn heirs. In some noble households, children mysteriously fell ill, disappeared, or were packed off to monasteries never to return. Not all accusations were true, but the fact they were believable reveals the anxiety these families lived with. Inheritance, the fuel for rivalry. At the heart of every step-family feud lay inheritance. Land was power. Without it, noble sons became nothing and able to marry, to serve, to rule. A lord with multiple sons and competing claims faced an impossible dilemma: divide the land and weaken the house, or favor one child and invite vengeance. Some tried to placate everyone. Others chose aggression. One famous case involved the powerful de Clare family in England. When Gilbert de Clare died, his widow Maud remarried. Her second husband schemed to divert lands to his new children. A bitter legal battle ensued, with sons from the first marriage raising troops to defend their inheritance. The conflict ended only with the king's intervention. But many others ended in bloodshed. Stepmothers who fought back. Not all second wives were victims or villains. Some became powerful protectors of their children, shrewd political players who secured marriages, forged alliances, and defended their children's rights with skill. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable queens of the medieval world, was stepmother to many. Though she ruled with tact, she was also feared. Chronicles describe her strategic marriages of stepdaughters, and her insistence that her own sons, Richard and John, receive prominent inheritance. One letter to the Pope reads, "The queen is as a lioness for her cubs. She does not yield nor forget." Blended families among the common folk, among peasants and townsfolk, the dynamics were simpler, but no less tense. When a man remarried, his second wife often entered a household with young children, with no servants, and with nothing of her own. She had to care for another woman's children while bearing her own, feeding them, clothing them, working beside them. Love may have grown, but so could resentment. Stepchildren could become labor rivals, inheritance threats, or sources of gossip. In 1371, a Miller S. widow in Kent was fined for brawling with her husband S. son by his former wife, whom she accused of spoiling the flour sacks and turning the milk. She was fined, but no one doubted her suspicion. Widows and the reverse dynamic. The reverse happened too. Widows who remarried, bringing their children into another man's household. Here, the tensions could run deeper. The new husband might have no blood loyalty to the children. If the children were male, he might fear future competition for his own heirs. If female, he might see them as burdens mouths to feed without dowry. And so, widowed mothers often sought powerful husbandsmen who could protect all children equally, or at least pretend to. Others chose the convent over remarriage, because in medieval society, a remarried woman was always at risk of losing control over her past. When stepfamilies worked, not all blended families fell apart. There are examples of stepchildren raised with love, of half-siblings bonded for life, of second wives who became cherished mothers in every sense. A 15th century merchant's diary describes his stepmother as gentle as wool, wise with the purse, and kind to all the children of the house. Love could grow, but so could mistrust. Because the medieval family, far from a haven, was a political battlefield, and the greatest wars were often fought behind closed doors. In the heart of a German village square, the air hung heavy with anticipation. Two figures stood silhouetted against the backdrop of an old church. Their faces grim, their postures rigid, they faced off, not as husband and wife, but as adversaries. He brandished a club. She waited patiently in a shallow pit. Her hand was wrapped tightly around a stone. The crowd stood hushed, their gazes fixed on the pit. And then, as if on cue, a gavel sounded, the signal for the contest. This wasn't a scene from a Hollywood movie. It was a real-life medieval divorce court. Welcome back to our series, where history's most bizarre divorce stories come to light. Today we explore the shocking custom of trial by combat, where couples fought for their marriage, sometimes to death. The dark reality of medieval marriages back in the Middle Ages, divorce wasn't as straightforward as a trip to the courthouse. In fact, it was much more complicated. If you wanted out of your marriage, you had to prove your case in front of a church court. If you were lucky, they would grant you an annulment, which meant they would declare your marriage never happened. But there was a catch. You needed a good reason for the annulment, like if you were too closely related to your spouse, or if you discovered they were already married. Otherwise, you were stuck with them for better or worse. For centuries, people believed that God joined the couple in marriage and only death could set them apart. But when push came to shove, people found ways around the divine bond. For most couples, their best option was to plead their case in front of a church court. But some weren't satisfied with the legal route. They wanted to settle their disputes in a more visceral way through combat. In some parts of Europe, specifically Germany and Austria, there was a bizarre custom where couples could take their fight to the literal streets. Trial by combat, a custom borrowed from ancient Germanic traditions, gave couples the chance to settle their dispute once and for all through a no-holds-barred duel. All they had to do was agree to face off in a public square, bare knuckle, until one of them tapped out or dropped dead. Now, you're probably thinking this sounds insane, and you're not wrong. But in the medieval mindset, this was seen as a fair way to settle disputes. After all, it gave the accused a chance to defend themselves, and the spectators got a front row seat to justice. There were rules. The man had to fight from a pit up to his waist in water, and he was only allowed to defend himself with a wooden club. The woman stood safely on dry land, but she could only use a stone wrapped in a linen cloth. As for weapons, the man could not touch the sides of the pit, and if he did, he lost. The woman couldn't drop her stone or touch the pit, and if she did, she also lost. If either of them tried to flee, the crowd could stop them and drag them back to the pit. It was a spectacle, a test of strength, and a gamble with fate. But if someone won, how exactly did they win? Well, if the man managed to touch the edge of the pit, he was declared the winner, and his wife, well, she was usually left with nothing but the clothes on her back. If the woman emerged victorious, she was allowed to keep her belongings, but her husband was often banished from the town, forbidden from ever setting foot there again. Not just blood and bones, while these trials might sound like something out of a medieval BDSM dungeon, they were actually a common sight in small towns across Europe. Records show that these fights weren't rare occurrences, and the stakes were high. Men and women from all walks of life took part in these duels, from peasants to nobles, and the battles weren't just about physical prowess. They were as much about reputation and social standing as anything else. Now, it's as hard to imagine why anyone would willingly step into a pit to duke it out with their spouse. But remember, this was a time when divorce was nearly impossible. If you were trapped in a bad marriage, your options were limited. You could endure the pain, find a discreet way out, or you could fight for your freedom, literally. But as shocking as these trials might seem, they weren't without precedent. Ancient cultures like the Greeks and Romans had similar customs, and they even found mention in the Bible. So while medieval Europe certainly had a taste for the dramatic, they weren't the first to think that love and war are two sides of the same coin. Join us next time as we continue to uncover the weird and wild world of historical divorce. Until then, remember, history is full of surprises, and sometimes those surprises come in the form of bare-knuckle brawls disguised as marriage counseling. Thanks for watching. The bells still rang, the vows were still spoken. The priest still said, "What God has joined," but something was changing. Slowly, quietly, like moss growing over stone. Marriage, once a cold transaction of land and lineage, began to bend, to soften. To feel, the medieval world did not wake one day and believe in romance. But over centuries, the idea that marriage could be built not just on property, but on partnership, not just on bloodlines, but on companionship, began to grow. This is the story of that evolution. A story of poets and peasants, reformers and rebels, and 1,000 little cracks in a wall that once seemed eternal. The foundations begin to shift. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was changing. The Black Death had gutted the population. Entire villages had vanished. Labor was scarce, and peasants had begun demanding wages, rights, choices, and among those choices, whom to marry. No longer could every lord dictate every peasant's spouse. No longer could families always afford lavish dowries. Love, once irrelevant, began to matter. There are records of couples in rural England and Flanders choosing their own partners, not nobility, not royalty, but common people, blacksmiths, bakers, wool spinners, who began to see marriage as something personal. The church didn't protest. After all, church law already said that consent was the heart of marriage. It just took society time to catch up. The rise of the companionate marriage. In academic circles, this new concept came to be called the companionate marriage, a union based not just on duty, but on shared affection, mutual respect, and the idea that a wife could be more than a vessel for heirs. She could be a partner. We see hints of this in letters between middle-class couples in 5th-10th century France and Italy, exchanges full of concern, tenderness, and small jokes. One Florentine merchant wrote to his wife, "I have received your wool, your bread, your good sense, and your scolding. I treasure all four, especially the last." Such words would have been unimaginable a century earlier, but now they were real. The printing press and the private mind. In the 1450s, Gutenberg's press began to change everything. Books were cheaper. Literacy began to spread first among merchants, then craftsmen, then even some peasants. People read not just psalms and saints, but stories. And in those stories, especially romances, marriage was no longer just obligation. It was a quest, a choice, a bond. Characters in books fell in love. They defied parents. They married for passion. Sometimes they suffered for it. But the idea had entered the public mind. And once an idea like that arrives, it doesn't leave. Reformers, heretics, and new voices. In the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation shattered the Church's monopoly over marriage. Martin Luther himself, once a celibate monk, married a runaway nun, Katharina von Bora. Their marriage, full of lively debate and shared labor, became a model for many. Protestant reformers began preaching that marriage was not a sacrament, but a covenant, a holy partnership where husbands and wives served God together. Marriage was no longer just about lineage or survival. It was about spiritual equality. Even in Catholic regions, similar ideas began to seep in, not always officially, but in practice. In towns and villages, people began expecting more from marriage, more than obedience, more than heirs. They wanted understanding. Urbanization and the shared home. As towns grew and urban life expanded, the medieval manor gave way to the city household. In cramped urban homes, husbands and wives often worked side by side running shops, managing accounts, raising children, tending customers. They could no longer live in separate spheres, and so slowly the ideal of the married team emerged. Marriage became a unit of labor and life, not just reproduction and rank. One 5th-10th century London widow, Margaret Elaine, wrote in her will, "Let none say my John ruled me, nor I him. We ruled each other as partners, and our home flourished not by strength, but by agreement." New laws, new rights. The legal system, too, began to evolve. In some cities, especially in the Low Countries and parts of Germany, married women began to gain more property rights. Wills recognized wives as co-owners. Courts began hearing petitions from women not just as victims, but as litigants. These were small steps, often informal. But each step reshaped marriage and made the voice of the wife harder to ignore. Love and practice. Let's be clear, not all marriages became romantic. Not all women were respected. Many were still bought, traded, beaten, or silenced. But the expectation of something more had taken root. Even noble marriages, once entirely about land, began to include emotional components. Kings wrote love letters. Queens demanded kindness. A few marriages, even among royalty, were known for affection. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York were said to mourn each other deeply. Despite marrying to unite warring houses, Margaret of Austria remained widowed after her young husband's death, saying no other man could match his heart. These were the exceptions, but they were no longer unthinkable. The power of expectation. By the end of the medieval period, people had begun to expect that marriage could bring more than duty. They wanted warmth. They hoped for companionship. Some even dared to seek love. And though society still clung to its hierarchies, still punished those who stepped out of line, it could no longer fully suppress this quiet revolution, because it wasn't made in law, it was made in hearts. Thus ends Part 19, the tale of 1,000 small shifts of poets, reformers, printers, and partners who slowly transformed marriage from a cage into a conversation. The candles have gone out, the gowns are folded away, the great halls echo with silence. But marriage, as it once was, has left its fingerprints on the world. Though centuries have passed since brides were bartered for sheep or land, since love was whispered only in secret, since battles were fought with words and wills and wedding beds, we still live with the shadows. This final chapter is not about what was, but about what remains, because medieval marriage is not just history. It is ancestry, it is architecture, it is the ghost behind every wedding vow. The legacy of ritual so many of our modern wedding customs, beloved, unquestioned, were born from medieval tradition. The white dress, once a rare sign of wealth and purity, echoes the gowns of noble brides who walked the church aisle under the heavy gaze of dynasty. The ring, placed on the fourth finger because it was believed to connect directly to the heart, survives from medieval symbolism. The idea of giving the bride away, once literal transfer of ownership from father to husband, is still acted out on altars across the world. Even the wedding kiss today, a sign of love, was once a formal sealing of a legal agreement, much like signing a contract. We reenact these rituals, but rarely do we ask, why? The lingering language we still speak of tying the knot, a phrase born from handfasting ceremonies. We still say man and wife, an echo of centuries when women lost their names and sometimes their rights, at the altar. We use husband as a verb, a husband resources, to manage, to control. Our very language remembers, even when we do not. The ghosts in the courtroom, modern divorce courts, inheritance disputes, custody battles, these are not new. They are descendants of medieval legal struggles when wives petitioned bishops for justice, when stepchildren fought over manors, when dowries were sued for and stolen. The questions asked today, who owns what? What do we owe each other? What happens when love ends? Were asked 1,000 years ago in candlelit halls, in cramped chancelleries, in stone churches. The answers change, but the ache does not. Gender, power, and the marriage bed, though much has changed, the power dynamics of medieval marriage still echo. The belief that men are the household's head, that women should serve, submit, sacrifice, these ideas, rooted in scripture and enforced by centuries of tradition, still whisper through our cultures. In some homes, they still shout. When women today fight for autonomy, equality, and respect in marriage, they are still battling ghosts, not just of bad husbands, but of systems built long ago, where a woman's silence was virtue and her body a transaction. And when love defies these systems, it is nothing short of revolutionary. The persistence of the ideal, the medieval world invented many myths about love and marriage. That women should be chaste and men passionate, that love is proven by suffering, that the perfect marriage is a union of opposites, one ruler. One ruled, these myths remain. In stories, in movies, in fairy tales, in the silent expectations we inherit. We imagine that marriage should be a rescue, a reward, a final destination. We imagine that once the vows are spoken, happiness is owed. We forget that even in the Middle Ages, marriage was hard. And that love, if it came at all, came after the altar, not before. What changed and what didn't? Yes, we've come far. Women can now marry by choice. Husbands can be partners, not masters. Love can be celebrated in all its forms across boundaries of race, class, and gender. But still, some families still arrange marriages. Some women still lose autonomy when they say, "I do." Some cultures still enforce dowries, purity, and shame. The past is not behind us. It is beneath us, like a foundation, or a weight. Why we remember, so why tell these stories? Why sift through ancient customs, cruel laws, strange rituals? Because in understanding where marriage came from, its flaws, its fears, its fictions, we gain power to reshape it, to decide what to keep and what to leave behind. A new kind of union today, more than ever, people marry not for land or title, but for love. That, too, has its roots in the Middle Ages, in the songs of troubadours, in the sighs of forbidden courtly lovers, in the whispered dreams of queens trapped in cold alliances. Love survived bureaucracy, it survived bloodlines, it survived the church and the contract. And now, for many, love stands at the center. But marriage is still what we make of it, a promise, a partnership, a prayer, or a performance. The past offers its shadows, but the future? That is ours.